When the man stepped onto the first-class cabin of the luxury airliner, he couldn't help but smirk at the sight before him. Sitting just a few seats away, hunched slightly, dressed in an unassuming button-down shirt and a pair of well-worn jeans, was an elderly man. His face was weathered, lined with deep creases of time, and he carried himself with the quiet demeanor of someone who had seen far too much. The younger man, in his mid-30s, was a self-proclaimed influencer, always searching for content that would get engagement on his social media. He whispered to his companion, loud enough for others to hear, "Looks like they're letting anyone into first class these days." His friend chuckled, not realizing that their snide remark had reached the ears of the older gentleman. As the flight prepared for takeoff, the influencer pulled out his phone, aiming to take a selfie. But before snapping the picture, he turned the camera towards the elderly man and muttered, "I swear first class isn't what it used to be. This guy looks like he got lost on his way to economy." A few passengers nearby overheard and exchanged disapproving glances, but no one spoke up. The flight attendants completed their final checks, and as the plane took off, the influencer leaned back in his plush seat, completely unaware of the storm brewing in his own fate. An hour into the flight, the passengers were served their meals. The influencer, ever the entertainer, decided to spice things up. As the elderly man took a bite of his meal, the influencer turned to his friend and said with a smirk, "Do you think he even belongs here? Maybe he's some washed-up has-been." His words barely settled in the air before an older woman across the aisle cleared her throat. She had been observing the exchange and had enough. "You might want to be careful who you're mocking, young man," she said firmly. The influencer, not one to back down, laughed. "Oh? And why's that?" he asked smugly. The woman's eyes narrowed. "Do you even know who that is?" The younger man scoffed. "Some random old guy who got lucky with a first-class ticket?" A low chuckle came from the elderly man himself. He placed his napkin beside his plate and turned his gaze toward the younger man. His eyes, though aged, had a sharpness to them, piercing yet calm. He extended his hand with a polite nod. "Clint Eastwood," he said simply. The influencer's face dropped. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The color drained from his face as recognition set in. Clint Eastwood. The legendary actor, the Academy Award-winning director, a Hollywood icon. The very man he had been mocking was one of the greatest figures in film history. Passengers around them watched as the younger man struggled to recover. He had spent the entire flight belittling a man who had defined American cinema for decades. The silence that followed was deafening. Eastwood, however, was unfazed. "You remind me of some folks I've met in Hollywood," he said with a slight smile. "Quick to judge, slow to listen." The younger man stammered. I didn't mean any disrespect, Mr. Eastwood. I had no idea." Eastwood gave a small nod. "I figured." The woman across the aisle shook her head. "Maybe next time you'll think before you speak." As the passengers began to disembark, the influencer lingered in the aisle, still reeling from the embarrassment of his actions. His mind raced with thoughts. How had he not recognized Clint Eastwood? How had he been so foolish to mock someone, without knowing their story? He wanted to apologize again, maybe even ask for a photo to salvage what remained of his dignity, but the words felt empty. He had spent the flight tearing down a man whose contributions to cinema and culture far outweighed anything he had accomplished with his social media presence. As Eastwood rose from his seat, he adjusted his belt and gave a polite nod to the flight attendants who responded with warm smiles. They too knew exactly who he was. He moved with the grace of a man who had lived through decades of success and hardship, unfazed by petty comments or the arrogance of youth. The influencer watched as Eastwood made his way to the exit. Just before stepping out, the Hollywood legend turned slightly and locked eyes with him once more. "Son," he said in a calm, measured voice, "next time, think before you speak. You never know who you're sitting next to." With that, he disappeared down the jet bridge, leaving the younger man standing in stunned silence. The other passengers filed out, and as the influencer finally stepped into the terminal, he noticed several people approaching Eastwood. They weren't rushing him for photos or hounding him for attention. Instead, they were thanking him for his films, for his impact, for being an inspiration. The influencer felt a pang of regret. He had wasted an opportunity to have a meaningful conversation with a living legend. Instead of showing respect, he had chosen mockery. Instead of learning, he had judged. As he walked toward baggage claim, he pulled out his phone, staring at his reflection in the dark screen. The same phone he had used to make fun of an unassuming older man was now a reminder of his own ignorance. He scrolled through his notifications, but for the first time, social media didn't feel important. What mattered was the lesson he had just learned. Respect is earned, but wisdom is learned. And today, he had been taught a lesson he wouldn't soon forget. As the influencer made his way through the terminal, his mind replayed the entire flight like a movie scene he wished he could edit. His arrogance, the laughter, the careless words, it all seemed so small now, so insignificant in the presence of someone as monumental as Clint Eastwood. He had built his online brand on quick wit and sarcasm, gaining followers by making jokes at the expense of others. But for the first time, he realized just how hollow that kind of fame was. He had spent years chasing clout, but standing before a man like Eastwood, he felt like a child who had just been scolded by the universe itself. As he reached baggage claim, he overheard two older gentlemen speaking nearby. "Can you believe that was Clint Eastwood?" one of them said, shaking his head in admiration. "A true legend. He's been in this industry for over 60 years, directed, acted, produced, he's done it all." The other man nodded. And still humble. No entourage, no ego, just a man traveling alone, like anybody else. Their words hit the influencer, like a freight train. Clint Eastwood didn't need to announce who he was. He didn't demand attention. His legacy spoke for itself. He had built a career on grit, talent, and respect, things that couldn't be measured in likes or retweets. Feeling a gnawing guilt in his stomach, the influencer did something he rarely did. He put his phone away. No tweeting, no Instagram stories, no viral apology video. This was something he needed to sit with, something he needed to process without the validation of strangers. Outside the airport, he spotted Clint Eastwood one last time, stepping into a waiting black SUV. No fanfare, no flashing cameras, just a quiet exit, the way a true icon carries himself. The influencer took a deep breath and shook his head at himself. He had been given a front row seat to a lesson in humility, and he knew he had a choice. He could ignore it and continue down the same path, or he could change. As he hailed a cab, he opened his phone again, not to post, but to search. He typed in Clint Eastwood biography and started reading. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't looking for content. He was looking for wisdom. As the cab pulled away from the airport, the influencer sat in silence, scrolling through article after article about Clint Eastwood's life. The more he read, the more embarrassed he felt about his earlier behavior. He learned about Eastwood's humble beginnings, how he worked odd jobs before making it in Hollywood. He read about his service in the military, his rise to stardom with Rawhide and the good, the bad, and the ugly, his transition into directing, and how he had won multiple Academy Awards. He wasn't just an actor, he was a visionary, a storyteller, a man who had spent his life shaping cinema. But what struck him the most wasn't Eastwood's fame, it was his character. Stories of his professionalism, his respect for his craft, and his ability to stay grounded despite decades of success. Unlike so many celebrities today, Eastwood didn't flaunt his status or seek validation. He let his work speak for itself. The influencer felt a deep sense of shame. He had spent years crafting a persona built on being loud, on making jokes at others' expense, on chasing temporary moments of internet fame. Yet here was a man who had lived an extraordinary life and didn't need to prove a thing to anyone. He put his phone down and stared out the window. For the first time in a long time, he felt something unfamiliar, humility. By the time he reached his apartment, he knew he couldn't just brush this off as another awkward moment. He needed to change. He needed to be better. That night, instead of filming his usual reaction videos or scrolling through trending topics for content ideas, he did something different. He opened his laptop and started writing a letter, though he wasn't sure if he'd ever send it. Dear Mr. Eastwood, I don't expect you to remember me, but I'll never forget you. A few days ago, I was the arrogant guy on your flight, the one who made a fool of himself mocking someone without knowing who they were. I want to apologize, not because you need it, but because I do. I've built a career on sarcasm and cheap jokes, but sitting near you for just a few hours taught me more about character than I've learned in years. You didn't react with anger, didn't call me out, didn't seek revenge. Instead, you carried yourself with quiet dignity, letting your presence do all the talking. I've spent years chasing attention. You've spent a lifetime earning respect. I don't know if this letter will ever reach you, but if it does, I just want to say thank you for your work, your wisdom, and most of all for teaching me a lesson I desperately needed. Sincerely, a guy who still has a lot to learn. He sat back, staring at the words on the screen. He didn't know if he'd ever send it, but that wasn't the point. The point was, for the first time, he wanted to be someone worth respecting. Not for fame, not for views, but because it was the right thing to do. And just like that, the lesson from a single flight had changed his entire perspective.